The most important skill right now where I think a human is needed is to remove things, say like what not to do. There's this misconception that Steve Jobs used to be this like super creative genius, but I don't think that's what made him so unique. He was just the greatest editor of all time. He would just say no to 99% of things, and the 1% that he'd say yes to made it to us. Today's slop looks very different than like the slop from a year ago. I don't want to hire 10 people to do the actual building so that I can be the middle manager again. You are the one who is very good at building in the first place, and that's why you have customers.
What is the bear case for being a solo founder?
It takes a certain type of crazy to found something in the first place. But I think not knowing whether you're actually crazy or not having a sounding board can be really, really hard sometimes.
What is the case for solo founding?
You only have to account to yourself. It's a big mistake to wait for the right person to join you. Start it.
Can you share a little bit more about what a Renaissance Geek is and why it's the era of older founders?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying younger founders don't have it, but I think in my case, and I think I'm seeing this over and over, I just saw a bunch of tweets along those lines as well. It's an interesting time because right now, when you have a lot of intuition for what works and what doesn't, and when you learn a lot about, I don't know, different roles in software development, smaller teams, larger teams, whatever. Like in my case, I have started my journey as an individual contributor, like many, right? Front-end engineering, design, etc. And then I started going to Fang. I did my own startup, sold it into Zynga, went into Fang, worked at Google for a couple of years. So I basically did the whole thing from like engineer to engineering manager to manager of managers. So, and at some point, you kind of feel like, okay, well, in order to climb the hills, you have to give up founder life, or you have to give up making things yourself. And I hated that. In fact, like I thought that's the only way to have impact. But now, through AI, I think if you have good enough intuition for what works and what doesn't, and you've learned enough about your craft and your adjacent crafts, and you have less hidden unknowns, basically less unknown unknowns than before, and you know what you're not good at, I think it's a kind of an ideal time to work with AI to simply shape whatever you want to shape. And so that's how I feel about being a founder now. I think I might not have the same amount of energy as a 20-year-old, but I can make up for it in intuition and in craftsmanship.
It feels like in a lot of ways, you've been at the front of kind of unlocking the ability for more people to build using the internet and the latest technologies over the last while. I mean, maybe you can take people who are listening through kind of like the jQuery stuff and the Chrome stuff and to where you are today. It's a really interesting arc. And, I think that at one point you described this as lowering the floor and then raising the ceiling. So maybe you could share what that actually means and sort of how your kind of life has led to you kind of consistently working on this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for the longest time, I actually called this anti-gatekeeping because I wanted to open the gates for more people. Like, I mean, whether that's Gamergate or, whatever, there's so many different moments in internet culture where one group didn't allow another group to participate. And that's been a recurring theme, I feel, for my internet experience, at least for my digital experience. And the first time I noticed that was as a teenager. I started putting myself out there. I kind of called myself a prototype creator of sorts, because for me, I wasn't really that interested in the syntax of coding, but I wanted to put a website out there to just have my voice heard. And I think that was kind of like the quickest way to do it. So put a website on your own computer, connect it with a plug, right? And then the whole world can see what you're up to. As opposed to, I don't know, like going to TV or radio or whatever, where like you have to ask for permission to get accepted. And so I thought that permissionless culture was really cool. And I wanted to do more of that. And so I invested a lot of my career into the open web. But then a couple of years later, I noticed that building anything really amazing and interactive and beautiful on the web had a lot of gatekeepers. So there were all these hardcore JavaScript engineers who are like, no, if you're a web designer or if you're just like somebody who's not a programmer, you can't participate, right? So this was pre-WordPress, or around the time WordPress started to become a thing. It wasn't really, CMSs weren't really a big thing yet. And that never really sat right with me. At the time, I wanted to build more interesting experiences. I worked on these large-scale JavaScript applications for Deutsche Telekom, T-Mobile back in Germany. And that was pre-Gmail, right? Back then, those were actually like the biggest, I would say, JavaScript clients, like web clients that would do email and calendar and stuff like that. Maybe not as cool as Gmail, but at least it was a really interesting large-scale project. And back then, there wasn't really a lot of JavaScript work going around. So it was very, very interesting. But I hit the edges of what was possible with just vanilla JS all the time. So I looked out for frameworks. And one of those frameworks that I found that opened the gates for a lot of people was jQuery. So jQuery was like a couple months old. It was this quirky JavaScript library that a lot of people found really odd at first. I remember that. It was like, people were like, this is a weird way of scripting. I don't know if that makes sense. But it gave so many web designers and people who maybe didn't call themselves engineers the chance to participate. And I love that. I love that it gave me the chance to participate in a bigger way. And so I invested a lot of my time into jQuery, fixed a lot of bugs, became part of the core jQuery team in the process. And then I was particularly interested in UI. So I invested a lot of my time into drag and drop, accordions, whatever was needed to build rich user interfaces at the time. There was a library, a third-party framework called Interface at the time that a Romanian developer created. And it was also really buggy. So I fixed a lot of the bugs and helped participate and contribute there too. And the guy became really busy, I remember at some point, and wanted to do his own thing. And then John Rezik, who created jQuery, asked me to start an official library for jQuery, and that turned into jQuery UI, which gave me an interesting front row seat at the Web 1.0 to Web 2.0 conversion, I would say, going from static sites to like more interactive experiences.
Now, we'll talk more about sort of the transition from that time to, working on DevTools in Chrome and to where you are today. But it's really interesting because I think that a lot of people, they might be watching this or listening and they say, well, this guy has worked on, all sorts of really big projects, and he's, worked at Google, and he like sold a company to Zynga. It sounds like he's really deeply enmeshed, and he just raised a massive round from A16Z. So he must be like, he's an insider, right? But growing up, you were pretty removed from all this. Because I remember you came, the first time we met, you came to a late night coffee shop that we host here at the house, and you were telling me about this, and it turned out that you grew up in the Black Forest in Germany, a town that I actually studied abroad in really briefly, and it is about as far away, both geographically and maybe from a mindset perspective, as what you'd expect to be sort of in Silicon Valley. So maybe share kind of what it was like growing up in a place that was pretty removed from startups and technology, and sort of how you ended up, getting involved in all this. Because I'm assuming that this was still pretty early on in your life that you started tooling around with JavaScript and then getting involved with the jQuery team.
Yeah, totally. I think back then, it's a good point. It wasn't really perfectly obvious, and I didn't grow up with a tech family in Silicon Valley, right? Yeah. I did grow up in the Black Forest, and I also ultimately moved away from that place because I always felt like it was like 10 years, 15 years behind when it comes to technology. Now, no shade. I think there's some cool startups there now. I mean,
yeah, it's incredible.
Black Forest Labs, amazing, right? Huge success story for Freiburg, for the Black Forest. But yeah, back then, there wasn't really a lot going on, right? And I know I read about Google. I was really interested in Google. My mom reminded me recently that I always wanted to work for Google. And I totally forgot. Like, I worked at Google at the time, and she said, you always wanted to work for Google. What? But apparently that was my dream when I was a teenager. And then the web for me was kind of a normalizing factor, because at least in the early 2000s, there weren't really so many pockets of the web, I feel like. It was a much smaller crowd that even was active on the web in the first place. It was all, at least where I was at, was all in English, and not that many subcultures yet. I mean, that's arguable, but it really felt like a big village in ways that connected me to the rest of the world, and where I could be at the actual cutting edge. I mean, the kids call it frontier now, right? As opposed to, I don't know, what's happening in local offices, down the road, which might still be, might not be that relevant anymore, right? And that helped me tremendously. I remember right-clicking. I mean, this is a similar story that many had early on. Right-clicking on websites, view source, reading the source code, just seeing what's going on. It's also interesting because you then build things, and then you never know whether you are hopelessly late or really advanced. Like, you have no idea, right? Because there are no other people to talk to. I mean, I was just this weird kid in a basement who was coding and putting things out there. And I got some early validation since I worked in one of my summer jobs, I think, was working in a phone shop. And they had like a support program thing, and they didn't have any software to manage support requests. So the owner realized I could build him something. So I did. And he's like, whoa, this is crazy. And so I got some initial early validation through some of these art jobs. But it took a while until I realized, I think this open source stuff, these things that I'm building, they're actually very useful to more people than just my local community.
It's interesting too, because you're talking about back then when you were getting started, it was relatively early in the days of the internet. And you could be working at some odd job and the owner could say, oh, could you build that for me? And in many ways, the story is still the same right now, right? I mean, there are people who are, young people who are starting, maybe their first job outside of high school. Maybe it's a job while they're in college. And maybe they're not even thinking of themselves as engineers, like you're much more of a coder mindset. But nowadays, there's so many problems and things that could be built and addressed with the tools that are available. And it feels now more than ever, you could actually get a differentiated insight for something to work on through some odd job. There's a person in the Solo Founders Program, he had a high school internship. He ended up then he really enjoyed it, but he ended up going to school, college. And, after he was in college, he said, well, that high school internship taught me about this problem that I really want to solve. He ended up working on it. Now he's at 3 million ARR completely on his own, and it's all from that insight that he developed at this internship. And you could just take those insights and go build businesses now. So I'm curious, what's the story of going from, being a contributor to such an incredible sort of foundational infrastructure? What's the transition from that to like going and starting your first company? What did that look like?
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned the internships too. I think I've done a few of those over the years, and I remember creating my own consulting business when I was 11 or 12, and I had to go in front of the city office. I remember that in my local community to get a special exception to be able to create a company.
Because you were so young.
Yes, because I was so young.
This is interesting. So this was in Freiburg, was this?
This was in a city near Freiburg called Waldkirch, yeah.
Okay, so you actually need to go get permission from the city.
Yes.
Interesting. That's not something that happens in America, I don't think.
Super strange, yeah.
Okay, so you go, what happens when you go up to talk? You have to actually talk to them in person?
Yeah.
So what did they say? What were they asking?
You get a hearing, and they, my mom had to come along with me, right? And they're like, wait, this boy wants to create a company. Like, how does that make any sense? And then just please explain. And then they gave me a special permission. Yeah.
So it worked. They let you do it.
It worked. Yeah,
okay.
I didn't make much money with that company, but it did work.
Okay, so that was your first kind of company. When did the concept of startups come into play, and what was your first like actual startup?
Yeah, to be honest, I always stumbled into my next problem. So I was never really looking to create a company. I was always looking to solve an interesting problem, and that's actually still true today. with the first startup, that was a game engine startup. So I worked on jQuery UI. I would say that was a really good success. A lot of people started using it to build user interfaces on the web. And then I figured out, okay, well, what else can I do on the open web? How can I enrich the open web even more? And I was always an avid gamer. I love games. And I wanted to bring games to the web. I thought, hey, well, maybe we can anti-gatekeep and sort of open the gates for everybody who wants to be a game developer. Maybe every web developer can be a game developer. So that was my next idea of where to take this.
And just to give people an idea, when was this? Like
that was
the date?
2010.
Amazing. Everybody can be a game developer in 2010. That was a great view of the future.
That was the idea, right?
Yeah.
Now, it didn't fully work because, I mean, we made technology work, but the distribution was the problem. So distribution monetization wasn't really like a solved problem. But we built a whole game engine from scratch that would then be able to power isometric games like Farmville or something like that. And so we made it work on the original iPad, which was really not a fast device by any means, and built this game engine startup. We wanted to build more than just the game engine. We wanted to build an isometric version of Facebook, basically, like, a fully visual isometric world as a flagship product that would then sell the engine. But it never quite got that far because frustratingly, and so this was me and a previous colleague of mine founded this company together, and we figured, hey, this is going to be this is a novel idea. Nobody has done it before. How hard is it gonna be to raise some funding for this, right? Turns out very hard. Turns out in Europe at the time, the most successful investors were the Zynga brothers, who created a copycat culture in Germany in particular that made it very difficult for a new founder who doesn't have any successful commercial track record, at least, to start something new, completely new, that isn't proven. So the number one question that we got from every investment meeting was, well, is this a proven idea that we can invest in, right? No, it's not. It's a new idea. And so it was really, really challenging to raise capital, but at the same time, it was very, very easy to get interested customers. So we had all of these very large companies lining up, like Microsoft wanted to license the engine, I believe. Like Zynga wanted to license the engine. Many big names that I didn't see coming, like knock on the door of a small German startup, but there was a lot of demand. So in the end, we went through an acqui-hire and got acquired by Zynga, where I worked for a couple of years building R&D. But yeah, it was just the search for the next big problem that led me there. And the next big problem was bringing games to the web.
Most people think that starting a company without a co-founder is a bad idea. We believe the opposite, that solo founding will become the default way great companies get started. And that's why we built the Solo Founders Program, where solo founders spend 3 months in San Francisco building solo together. Our alumni say it's like having co-founders but getting to make their own decisions. And 4 cohorts in, we're starting to see just how much solo founders can accomplish. One secured a formal partnership with a major US government institution just 5 months after incorporation. Another hit 20,000 GitHub stars and 3 million downloads. And a third got 2 million ARR before making a single hire. The demand for the program continues to grow. Our first cohort got 1,000 applications for 6 spots. Our 4th cohort got 4,500 for 10. And today we are officially opening applications for cohort 5. We'll select about a dozen founders, I'll work closely with each of them, and we'll invest $100,000 in every company. We kick off September 10th. If you're building solo or you're ready to start, apply at solofounders.com.
You said you'd worked with your co-founder previously. What was that like, and sort of how did you decide to end up starting a company together after working together previously?
Yeah, we worked in the same agency back in Germany. That was my actually very first W-2 job of sorts, salary job, and we just got along really well and we meshed well. And he was also a really avid gamer, and so we figured we have something in common. And he saved a bunch of cash to invest into the company, and so it was a good it worked out really well where I brought in the tech chops, and he was the CEO who would try to raise and set up commercial partnerships and do everything around the thing. But yeah, we just reconnected after a few years and then got going.
That's so cool. So that was around 2010, you were saying. Yeah. And now it's 16 years later. Crazy to say, because it probably doesn't feel like 16 years. And
crazy.
You're now building a company solo. And you were not the CEO for that company that we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. You're now effectively, at least until you have, I know you're hiring. You started out as everything, right? with this new company. Yes. Why solo this time?
Why solo this time? Yeah. So now I'm solo, and to be honest, there was this moment in my life last year where I really realized I need to get building again, and so I found myself suddenly without a job. I think this was around March or so last year, and again, I kind of climbed up the hill to essentially like upper middle management or something like that, and leading larger teams. And I realized I don't really want to do that anymore. It's not interesting to me. And I want to figure out how far can I push a new idea by myself? How far can I scale myself? Because I've read about this idea of the solo company that becomes $1 billion unicorn, right? But I didn't fully believe it yet. I'm like, I don't know. Like, is this real? Like, can you really be a 100x engineer by scaling yourself that way? And I just wanted to prove it to myself. I think that was the first moment where I thought, yeah, let's give it a try. Let's see how far I can push it. And so I built myself a lot of tooling to scaffold. I took on some really intentionally very challenging contract projects that would replace 5 to 10 person dev agencies to see, is that possible? And I think the answer is yes, but we're still early and we're still figuring out how to. I think interestingly, the biggest problem right now is attention. I think I can use a lot of agents, spin up a lot of agents to do the work for me, but my attention span is limited. So that's the most challenging aspect. Peter Steinberger talked about this a couple of days ago as well.
Yeah, what did Peter say in particular that resonated with you?
He talked about attention. So he talked about how you can create these software factories in that you can scale almost anything related to software development except human attention. And so now he's optimizing for his own attention and figuring out how to do effective work in bursts. And that really resonated.
What have you learned in this process? Because you've been at it now for a little while, building the stuff that kind of was the precursor to the company, which is building Impeccable. The company's called Renaissance Geek. But what are the things that you've learned so far about this, about your own sort of insights into your own attention?
I think the most important thing is that I have to protect my time building. So for the last couple of months, initially I intentionally did not raise any money because I wanted to give myself time to gain momentum and just create maximum value. So every time I wake up, and I still do this, by the way, I wake up and think about, okay, what value am I going to create today? Because a day without creating value is really sad. So I think about that every day, and that drives me. And for the first couple months of the startup, that's the only thing I'll be obsessing about. How can I make Impeccable, my project, better? How can I make it a slightly better? How can I solve a current user problem? And there are so many things of the CEO job, of the founder job, that are not about creating user value. And that's something that I'm very focused on, to make sure that I protect that build time. And I don't think that's unique with me, but I'm trying my utmost possible to contract away or just remove a lot of the actual operation work so I can focus on building. I also don't want to change that, by the way. I don't want to hire 10 people to do the actual work, to do the actual building, so that I can be the middle manager again. There's zero interest in that on my side. I want to operate completely differently.
So I know, at least at the time that you wrote the blog post announcing the company and the funding and the GitHub partnership, you talked about hiring a chief of staff. Are you still hiring that, or did you find that person?
I found the person. I can't really talk about who it is.
Sure.
But yes.
Could you share a little bit about kind of how you think about hiring a chief of staff as, a solo founder who's getting started? This is one of the first hires that you're making. What have you heard from other people about that? Maybe you already had some intuitions about what you were looking for. What advice have you gotten about making that type of hire?
Yeah, I think I initially thought I'd need a combination between chief of staff, head of operations, and executive assistant. One of the first pieces of feedback that I got is that's a terrible idea. Do not try to make that also an executive assistant. And so feedback heard, right? Makes sense. The work is different. But I put the EA part into the job description because, and I don't have EA in the job description anymore, but I still have bullet points that say do grunt work or whatever, and have some examples of really intentionally basic work. Because I'm the type of founder, but also manager, who will do that naturally. Even in my previous job, where I led a pretty decent sized team, from time to time, I would bring somebody a coffee if they looked like they needed a coffee. Wherever I could create value, no matter what job, no job would be too small for me. And that low ego mentality, that sort of everything is my job, I needed that in that role. So that's very important for me. I also intentionally did not call it head of operations because it would attract sort of McKinsey consultants who might have been in a FANG position for a while and are too senior and maybe don't really understand the grind of a small startup anymore. That's the other thing. So intentionally, if you look at the job description, it's not boring. It's actually written the way I would write it, just naturally. When I explain it to you, it's hey, this is a job where you have to get shit done, where you really have to roll up your arms and just do whatever is needed to make sure that we all can spend our time on the most effective use of our skill set. That was most important to me. And so it's, you need to find somebody with low ego who can naturally transition along with the company. Maybe that starts being, for example, right? Initially, it's maybe a bunch of investor projects, some certifications that we still need. Maybe it's setting up some bank account or getting more employees' credit cards. But then later on, it's a special partnership with some large company, or it's something that is completely different, set up Stripe at scale. It could be anything. But I've worked with quite a lot of operations people in larger companies like Google who would be eaten alive in that role. So that's something I will say, right? Who have focused on just one aspect of operations and they think they can do it in the real world, but they can't. I can guarantee you they can't, or they're not prepared, at least. Maybe they can learn how to do it, but I had to have that conversation with a few of my friends from these larger places, and give them some real expectations.
And the reason I ask about this is because my guess is that when you were building your first company and you were thinking about who you were going to hire, chief of staff was probably not the second hire or the first hire. I don't even know if you had a chief of staff at that first company. So
I did not.
I just wanted to get a little bit more about the philosophy around hiring a chief of staff for an early stage startup, especially as a solo founder, because there's less. You don't have co-founders to have sort of early division of labor, and I think it might be a role that becomes more prominent earlier on at solo founded companies than maybe it would be at traditional sort of multi-founder companies.
I see. Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think the reality is I need that chief of staff to protect my time. I think that's the most important goal here. I am a very reluctant CEO, I would say. I really don't want to be the type of CEO that does everything that a CEO does, the operations bits, I never loved it. I always loved the building. Now, there are multiple ways of solving that. Right? One is you hire the people who actually do the building for you, and I think that's what most people do. Right? Most people, instead of hiring a chief of staff, they hire an engineer, a designer, a product manager, whatever is needed to actually get the building off your plate. Right? So now you're getting the building off your plate, and you're the chief of staff, essentially. Right? You're the operations person. That's now your role. I think that's a trap. I think it's really silly because like if you are the one who is very good at building in the first place, and that's why investors invested in you, and that's why you have customers, etc., why give that up? That doesn't make any sense. So I think this is probably true for a lot of solo founders right now. And so I guess my one recommendation would be don't fall in that trap. Much better, in my opinion, to hire somebody who's very good at operations, also like a chief of staff / operations hybrid role, who can scale up with whatever operational stuff is needed, and have them be the acting person that takes all that clutter off your plate, so you can actually focus on building.
Super good advice, and I think it's something that we will see a lot more of. Let's talk about Impeccable. Let's talk about Renaissance Geek. I think that the first thing to say is this has clearly struck a chord with a lot of people because it's got tens of thousands of stars on GitHub for Impeccable itself. Maybe share for those who are hearing about it for the first time what Impeccable is, and then why you decided to start a company around it.
Yeah, Impeccable is an agent skill, I would say, first and foremost. So skill, for those who don't know, is a way of extending your coding harness, your coding agent, with some additional functionality. In this case, it's one that makes your coding agent better at design. So it makes you better at design, hopefully, but also your actual AI better at design, so that it doesn't produce the same bad outcome that is clearly, you look at it and it's clearly made by AI. You don't really want that, right? You want something intentional, and you want to steer it in the proper way to get to where you need to go. So that's Impeccable in a nutshell. It gives you the vocabulary of design, and it also comes with a visual iteration mode that allows you to generate variants on the fly together with your coding agent. And then it removes AI slop. So slop is a big topic nowadays. And slop is also a moving target. So like today's slop looks very different than like the slop from a year ago. And Impeccable sort of does two things. It creates a really solid baseline. So like decent, good design. And that's what I meant by like lowering the floor. So basically allowing more people to participate, but also raising the baseline of decent design. And then the second one is getting from good to great. That's still where like a human is needed right now. And inserting that human at the right times is super important. And that's also something that Impeccable focuses on. So yeah, it's been a bit crazy, I will say. Impeccable was something that I've built for myself because I needed it. I became really frustrated at the time working with Claude Code, because it would never quite understand my intention. Right? I would say like, make this bolder. And then, it turned everything black or whatever, like blue. And it's like, that's not what I meant. I meant like, no, it needs to be, attracting the eye of the consumer more. And you shouldn't move away from my design system. Like it means something specific in the world of web design. And I noticed when designers would be using Claude Code, and I am one, but I've also worked with large engineering teams and coached them doing these contract jobs. And I noticed when designers would use these tools, they would get better outputs. And really the type of language that you use matters. And so I packaged that up and put it into a skill for myself, first and foremost. Impeccable is, by the way, not the first open source project that I shipped earlier this year. I released a whole bunch of others. But Impeccable was the one that had the most impact on people.
Similar to OpenClaw, how Peter had released a lot of other things.
That's right.
Before that, and they all sort of fit together, but that one was the big one.
Absolutely, yeah. And so it really struck a chord with people in ways that I didn't expect, and then it just developed a life of its own.
It's really cool because, I mean, we use Impeccable all the time. I think the thing that we like the most about it is what you talked about with regard to understanding a design system versus just being good at sort of baseline design ideas and concepts. Because as you said, usually when you give a prompt to Claude Code, unless you're extremely specific, and even maybe sometimes if you are, it still can tend to sort of ignore some of the nuances. And it will shift away from maybe the design system that you have in place to something else. And maybe that's good from a prototyping to see what this could possibly look like perspective, but it's not a good thing from a production perspective. And I've been really impressed by just how much we can take a design system from one place that we have for solo founders and be able to spin up new applications that are in the solo founders universe that have a lot of the flavor and the verve that we've developed for solo founders, but could be translated and ported over to new systems, new user interfaces. And I know for a fact that when we try that with just something like Claude Code or Codex, it's actually really lacking.
Yeah.
But when you loop in Impeccable, it actually works quite well. What's actually going on behind the scenes there? What was the insight that you had in terms of how to make it so that it doesn't stray and it also sort of follows these principles?
Yeah, I mean, it started with the vocabulary, so basically allowing you to steer in different directions. But then, why does it work? Why does it stay on brand? It's a good question. The first thing is it does, when you initialize Impeccable, it first does a product interview with you. And so it asks you about your app or your website or what you're building, right? And it's not just superficial. It doesn't just ask you what colors does your page use or whatever. And sure, it looks through your code base as well. But it also asks about who's your audience? Who is this for? Turns out if you are building, let's say, like an iPad app for kids, right? It's very important for a designer, let's say go to a real agency, right? Very important for a designer to know, is this website that I'm building for the parents of these kids or for the kids, right? Now, if you go to lego.com, you get like a kid's website and a parent's website. They branch. And so that's critical. Like in many other design tools, AI design tools, that question never pops up. And so the first is a product interview. The second part is DesignMD. So the Google Stitch team created this new spec called design.md, and that holds your tokens, your typography, a bunch of other things about your own brand, your own design system. It doesn't it's not a substitute for your whole design system, but it's good enough to at least stay somewhat on brand. It gives information about the components in your system. And so Impeccable creates this DesignMD if it's not present for your own website as well, and keeps it up to date over time. So anytime you actually then use a command, it's like, well, I need to redesign this case study website, for instance, or section. It will actually load both the product MD and the design MD as context. And then there's also design hooks under the hood that if it writes something and it maybe didn't follow all rules in the skill, there's a hook that fires afterwards in the coding agent to keep it honest, right? So for instance, it will detect if there's certain AI slop introduced, but it will also detect, for example, let's say it introduced a different font or a color that's not in your design system. It will actually flag that under the hood without you even seeing it. It's transparent. And then sometimes Claude or Codex or wherever it's supported, GitHub Copilot, will react and say, actually, I just noticed that I made a mistake here. I'm going to revert this and stay on your system, on your brand. So there's a lot of things that have to be orchestrated to keep you on that lane.
Now, oftentimes, people come across like their business idea in different ways, or they start out thinking they're going to start a business, or they start out just wanting to solve this particular problem. In the case of Impeccable, and that's just one of the projects from your company, Renaissance Geek. Mm-hmm. How did you actually come to determine that this was going to be a business? Was that something that was pretty intentional from the start, or was it more you were sort of exploring this and you said, you know what, I kind of don't want to do this management thing that I'm doing at a larger company. I kind of want to go and start a company. So how did that actually come to be?
with my partner Anish at A16Z, who I'm very lucky to be friends with. I went on a bunch of walks with him in the last couple of months, and I used him as a sounding board to pitch my hopefully some of them stupid, some of them not so stupid ideas to. And at some point, I think we both got to the conclusion that there's probably enough there to even if like 2/3 of them don't work out, I'll figure it out. So that's the first aspect. That's beyond Impeccable. And so as a solo founder and as a founder in general, you're always going to have some pivot of some sorts. I mean, it's so rare to never pivot, right? I think that was the first important realization that if I'm now creating a company, there's definitely enough there in my own arsenal of ideas that one of them will probably work. That's what I had to tell myself before starting. That was really important. That's the first one. The second one was with Impeccable. Almost every week, I get somebody tweeting at me, saying something along the lines of, I don't understand why this is free. Like, why is this free? Or like, I want to pay for this. How can I pay for it? And that's really great PMF signal. Right? I mean, that's a signal that sometimes I would create something like a failed project, and I would hope for this. I would hope for this so much, for this to come. And I was convinced that it was a good idea, but I never quite got there. People would always be very nice and on a call when I were on a customer call with them, and it's like, yeah, I've tried it out. It's pretty good. But you never quite got that response.
Yeah.
And so that's happening organically now. I'm getting these tweets all the time. And that gives me the sense that there is a commercial story there. There's something that I can do here. So that was the other really important factor.
It's really interesting to release something that's just so immensely valuable for free. It clearly gains you a lot of mind share, a lot of love. What's sort of the logic behind it? Or did you originally know that the first thing you'd be putting out for people with the company would be free? And how do you think that maybe extends to other people who might be building things in the future? So how they should think about putting things out? There's all sorts of different opinions about focus on growth and focus on sort of distribution first versus focusing so clearly on monetization. Then other people say, you got to have people paying you immediately. Yeah. And I'm curious sort of what you've learned from all this and how you think that might be something that some people could take away a lesson from.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'll do a hot take here, but I think sort of the PLG stuff, like product-led growth, I mean, it can work, but I do think in today's age where everybody, I mean, it's an explosion of new vibe-coded products. Everybody's building something. So many people are building something for the first time, and it's exciting, but it also means it's so much harder to break through with an initial audience. And I think if you have no distribution whatsoever, no followers, no outlet to at least tell a few people about it, super, super challenging right now. And I definitely felt that a couple months ago when I embarked on this journey again, because my X account, I guess Twitter account, I don't know, like I've used it very actively in my jQuery days. And I was known for a specific thing. And that was sort of like UI/front-end development. And back then I was active, I tweeted almost every day, and it was a good social media platform for me, right? Then I completely neglected it for a couple of years. Then I started using it a little bit in the creator economy jobs that I had, but then people followed me for creator economy stuff. So then a couple months ago, I started tweeting again, and I tweet about this new stuff. I tweet about AI and design and generative user interfaces, and zero interest whatsoever by the algorithm, right? Zero. And I think these tweets are all certified bangers, and like nobody cares, right? And it's so frustrating. And so I realized, okay, well, it's not gonna work. Like I can put anything out there, like the best things since, I don't know, like sliced bread, right? But if it doesn't find an audience, I was never really quite the guy who would put on Facebook ads and hope for the best. I always needed some sort of organic spark that would work. And so the first thing I did was to think through, okay, well, how do I optimize for momentum in the first couple months and put myself on the map again. That was honestly really important to me because it clearly didn't work anymore. The people who followed me from before, I still had a bunch of thousand followers, right? But the one that followed me for different reasons, and the algorithm didn't pick it up. And so the first I did was realizing, okay, the X algorithm now rewards value. So I'm just gonna create the most valuable thing and put it out there that I can for free to see if anybody cares. And so I've done this with a bunch of projects now. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. But that really was a good strategy for me, because then I gained 1,000 followers here, 1,000 followers here. And then at some point, the algorithm changed overnight and picked up the signal and realized, okay, well, he's clearly in it for the right reasons now with the right audience. And now we will reward him or something along those lines. But that's what I tell myself.
It also feels like nowadays, with so many people making so many things so quickly, the faster you can lower the more you can lower the barrier to somebody actually trying your thing and experiencing it and then telling other people about it. It seems like that is just generally quite beneficial at this point.
Yeah, I was also always obsessed about this K-factor thing, right? True virality. And I think the most important thing is what happens, how do people talk about your product when you're not in the room, right? So you have two people who have tried out your product and now they have a conversation about your product. That's the really interesting stuff. And that's where the magic happens, or not, right? If they're like, I tried, it didn't really work, right? Okay, dead. But if they're like, you know what, I told 5 other people because this is the best thing, yes, you have something. And I'm hearing that more and more often now about Impeccable, and it makes me feel like I'm onto something.
What did you learn about virality and K-factor at Zynga? I mean, you were there for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, with Zynga, that was pretty much the only thing that mattered when I was there, right? We tried to create these games at hyper scale. And I think anything, if I remember correctly, anything that wouldn't hit at least 100 million DAU or something like that, or MAU, was a failure, right? I mean, it's insane if you think about it now. But that was the times where Facebook really rewarded games. And there were so many ways of gaming the profiles of people where, Farmville is a great example, right? Anytime you did some action, you click on tell all my friends about it or something, right? And then it would post on your profile. And so you have this massive influx of profile posts that all lead back into the games. And it was very easy to gamify virality at the time. Now that stopped though.
Yeah.
It's not as easy anymore. I think it was really great for a while, and then it became much harder again. And then there's also this thing with the whales. So I don't know if you read about this, right? But in many of the Zynga games, there were people who were extremely active, the whales, who spent a significant amount of money, and they kind of carried the whole ecosystem. And so you had virality on one end, and then you had these paying moguls on the other side. And it was very lucrative for a while.
How do you juxtapose sort of that kind of very consumer oriented K-factor stuff with something that has some, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are using Impeccable in non-professional ways just for passion projects and stuff like that. But how do you think about virality when it comes to more business oriented?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's this huge difference between forced virality, and I think that's something that we did at Zynga.
Yeah.
And I was never, I was rarely at building these games directly. I built 1 or 2 games, but mostly I was responsible for the technology behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. But talking to those game managers who were in charge of these game studios, definitely it was it was not something that would come organically. You would really make sure that that comes at all cost.
Yeah. I mean, same thing with Facebook engagement. I mean, they juiced not just Zynga on Facebook, but Facebook itself.
That's right. Yeah. But for my business now, I'm specifically not trying to force it. I think there's no good way of forcing it in my case. I think either people find it valuable or they don't find it valuable. The only thing I can optimize for is the individual experience, and then hope for the best. So it's I haven't done any outbound, for example.
Yeah.
Right? No paid ads, No, nothing. Like the only thing that I've done is tweets.
No UGC, no trying to get influencers to post about it.
Zero.
Some of that will happen just by nature of it being a great product.
Yeah, but it has happened. Exactly,
Yeah.
right? I mean, look, Fireship has done a video about Impeccable, or at least, a slice of a video about Impeccable, and that was completely organic. And people asked me afterwards, was this a paid thing? No.
That's always a good sign when
Yeah.
people are asking you, wow, that was incredible. Was that paid?
Yeah.
That's it's like, no, they actually just really like that.
But I will say, I have seen some businesses, and I have some friends who are running businesses that don't work without that growth loop.
Yeah.
And so you have a product, you have a front door, and you have to make sure there's always enough Facebook ads or always enough TikTok influencers talking about it, right? And so people come into the front door, and then there's massive churn, and you just get more people and fix that problem that way. That just isn't very interesting to me. I don't find that idea very pleasant. I would much rather have a really solid customer base and core who loves what I'm building than a lot of people who maybe like vibe code something with it or one shot something and then just sort of like move away again. It's just not interesting.
It also feels very aligned with kind of how you want to prioritize your time. When you're talking about sort of having people join the team to work on certain things while you focus on others, that seems to really be in line with it. And it kind of goes back to this idea that I'm constantly thinking about, which is like the shape of the business. And there are lots of different business shapes, and some of them could be great for one type of founder and really awful for another type of founder. I'm curious, as you sort of discovered who you are and who you're becoming, what you've learned about sort of your personal relationship to the shape of a business.
Mm-hmm. I think the shape of the business, but also like personal relationship to customers and to users maybe.
Yeah.
One thing that I learned is that integrity is probably more important to me than to many others that I work with. For example, it would be devastating to me to have somebody say like, I've used your thing and you advertised that something that didn't work. I would feel like a total failure at that point, because then I felt like a snake oil salesman. And I never wanted that. I always wanted to be respected for my craft and for what I put out there. And so my own sense of like quality and perfection is very, very important to me. And the same is true for team building and for like creating a business. I think it's very important for me. For instance, like one of the sayings that I have is be nice, but be kind, not nice. And I'm trying to be kind by being not nice sometimes. And I think that's a really good way to treat your coworkers with respect, by giving them real feedback as opposed to just niceties that are actually not true or not meant. So I feel like, especially in the world of AI right now, there's already so much snake oil.
Yeah.
Like skills are a great example. Most skills, I'm sure, are completely vibe coded.
Yep.
Right? You created it maybe for your own project, you test it 2 or 3 times, and then you ship it. And you're like, okay, here you go. And then you send it to others. But this is like building your own software, right? Compiling it on your own computer. And as long as it works on your computer, you think it works on every other computer. That's not how you distribute software, right? You have to actually test it. You have to make sure it works everywhere else. Many people don't know this, but Impeccable, every single line of the Impeccable skill is tested. I mean, in an evals harness to actually figure out, does it do something? I went through great lengths and I spent a lot of tokens and money to make sure that everything is ablation tested. If there's like an AI slop rule and it doesn't work, I actually removed it from the skill because it's so important for me. And still people will tell me or question, and say like, hey, I don't know, like, I mean, I installed the skill and then I asked it to do something, but maybe I also can do it without the skill. And so at a conference a couple of days ago, I showed a before and after with GPT 5.5. And one of it was using Impeccable and saying like, make this case study section bolder. And one of them was saying, okay, same thing, same prompt, same everything, but vanilla. And the differences were pretty clear. Yeah.
So I think that we've covered a lot of interesting ground with regard to your philosophy, talking about things like how to focus your time as a solo founder, essentially lowering the floor for accessibility to great technology and like abilities to actually make things and put them out into the world, while also increasing the sort of what's actually possible in terms of what the average like builder is capable of. We've talked about sort of how you've learned that over the years at a variety of companies. I'm really curious about your philosophy as it relates to sort of humans and like humans being in the loop for these creative practices. Right now, it is really necessary for a human to be involved on that maybe last 20%, last 10%. But I think that in a lot of ways, it seems like your philosophy is around human involvement sort of perpetually, and the idea that humans are essentially having a challenge with regard to kind of being able to pass their intent successfully to the AI to actually have the AI execute based off of what they really want. Can you share a little bit more about your philosophy around humans interacting with AI? And maybe we can go a little bit onto like interface side of that, but also just more the general prescription around what the real problem is with humans and AI right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So with humans and AI, there's two conversations right now happening. And I just came back from a conference where a whole bunch of people were talking about loop maxing and software factories, and some people call it orchestras, But the idea is the same, right? You create agents, these agents hand work to other agents, and at some point you have agents working with agents working with agents, and you might still say, here's my goal, but then all the work gets executed in like days and days of autonomous agentic work. That's one idea that people are pushing. Another idea is, people are saying, no, don't touch AI at all. Or, when you're using AI, do it piece by piece, right? You're just in one thread, and then you observe what the agent actually creates. You look at all the code that gets created. You read every line, right? You validate everything. That's the other extreme. I think the reality is actually somewhere in the middle. And when I say like put the humans in the loop, I actually think when you put them in the loop matters. In my opinion, for instance, for creative design work and most creative work, I think there's ultimately three big phases. And the reality is a bit more messy. You can go back and forth, but usually you have the early stage, sort of the what phase, right? What am I even making? Like you're making a website. What is even on that website? Who is it for, right? So this is more like product. At that point, I think it's pretty important to be in a loop. Like if you don't know why you need this, why do you make it? Why do you tell an agent to make it in the first place? Why does the agent determine to make it? Like that's one, right? Now the other one is the actual building. Now the building aspect, I think right now agents are still very easy and capable. Like agents are still very much drifting from an initial vision. And they do that sometimes randomly. So sometimes an agent will work on something for an hour and everything looks great and then shoots in a completely wrong direction, right? So without you monitoring and checking in from time to time, you might get terrible results. That might be a temporary problem. But anyway, it happens. And then there's the last part. So let's say the agent comes back to you, produce pretty adequate website, first draft. Now, how do you get it to 100%? I think for those last 10, 20%, you need to actively iterate with the agent. You need to put in your own point of view, your own judgment, your own perspective. One example is most agentic work today, like most code that's being written is actually too much code. Most articles that are being written are too long, right? Most design that's being created with AI is too verbose or too cluttered. So the most important skill right now where I think a human is needed is to remove things. Say like what not to do. So, no, actually this, you have to remove all of this part, right? Or this you have to simplify or that. And so that type of judgment is super, super critical at the current moment in time. And I also think there's kind of like a philosophical argument here to be made, and then there's a practical argument. I mean, I've talked to a whole bunch of my friends at the Frontier Labs about this, and I would say overall, most people think, at the labs at least, that the models will soon be good enough to build something adequate, something pretty good. Also design something pretty good. But the question is, if in the philosophical argument, if you have agents creating things for other agents in a world made for agents, what will we do? How do we come in? Like, what gives us purpose? Who is this all for? Where is this all going? I don't know. So there's definitely that. And I think about that all the time. I actually would really like to ensure that these agents are working for humanity, not against humanity. But then there's also the practical aspect of, I think at least for the next couple of years, AI will simply not be good enough to create great creative output. I truly believe that. I think we're getting to like decent in some categories, but I haven't seen anything one-shotted. Not video, not images, definitely not anything written. I mean, I tried to do a first draft of my announcement post, and it was so bad that I had to basically reword everything. Yeah. Definitely not code, and also not design. So none of these things get you to 100% right now. And this is why I'm sometimes quite frustrated with this narrative of, AI design tools and other types of tools positioned for vibe coders to be able to make a problem go away, right? Just use this and you'll have a landing page. Right? You just put a prompt and you get something good. That doesn't work. It has never worked so far. I have never seen anyone nail that. I think design is an iterative process and has to have a point of view of a human.
It feels like, in some ways, pretty good is always what a lot of people are striving for. I mean, and pretty good just continues to get a little bit better, but it's incremental. I mean, Look, like Squarespace, when it came out, it looked better than the other options that existed before it for the average person to set up, maybe a website for a business. They marketed the heck out of it. They spent so much money on advertising on every podcast imaginable. And, they did build a business off of that. But arguably, I would say that it was pretty good. And then also not impeccable. And then also, once Squarespace hit a certain saturation point of adoption, everything started to look like Squarespace, right? And similar to what you were talking about, how slop is a moving target. I remember when Twitter Bootstrap came out, which was sort of their open source library for web design, like web pages. Everything started to look like Twitter Bootstrap. And people would constantly complain about, it's just another Bootstrap themed website. Mm-hmm. And now it's with Claude and various things kind of look, they're pretty good. But there's a big gap between pretty good and something that's truly amazing, that feels one of one, that feels artisan. And I know you've written about sort of that idea of artisan versus factory made. Mm-hmm. I think it's really important. Another thing that you touched on around sort of this idea that more is not necessarily better. More words, more writing, more code. Like the whole idea that most books should be blog posts. Most blog posts should be tweets. Most tweets shouldn't even exist. There is so much to be said for. There's a lot of bloat out there, and there's also a lot of pretty good. And your goal is to essentially say to people, hey, if you're not just looking for pretty good, we're going to help you with pretty good, but pretty good is going to be even better. But if you actually want to go from pretty good to outstanding to one of one to singular, that comes from being in the loop. And we're trying to develop systems that really help you be in the loop.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, like on the thing about like removing, right, as opposed to adding, there's this common misconception that Steve Jobs used to be this like super creative genius, right? But I don't think that's what made him so unique. I think what made him so unique is his judgment. He was just the greatest editor of all time. Yeah. He would just say no to 99% of things, and the 1% that he'd say yes to made it to us, right? Is the stuff that we got into our hands. I mean, a lot of the work was created by other people, but he just had the capability, the uncanny ability to know what not to ship. And I think that's just so much more important now. It's kind of crazy.
It's also interesting because I was just reading an excerpt from the Walter Isaacson biography of Steve Jobs. It was talking about when he was going through his medical treatments. He was complaining about the designs of the face masks, and I think it was maybe the one of the machines to check your pulse or something. And he was talking about how they just weren't very good, and he wanted to see better design, and he would design a better one. It's like the guy was just obsessed with elimination and with really like cutting down to the core of what it is. Another thing that comes to mind from all of that is it feels like in many ways people maybe take away the wrong lessons from people like that, which is that it's always about subtraction or it's always about minimalism or something like that. I think that really what it comes down to is everybody has sort of their perspective, their thing that they put on the world. And when things don't stand out, it's often because the people are just kind of like doing whatever is on trend or what is normal. Or in this case, it's whatever the system is sort of set up as the default to do.
Yeah, but it's also interesting that that's not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on what you're doing, right? For example, if you're building an internal tool, or if you're building a system level application, use system fonts, right? Yeah. Use fonts that are already in the system, make people feel at home, right? If you're building something that would benefit from an enterprise customer already being able to orient themselves, right? Yeah, like copy an existing UI, make it work like something they're already used to, right? Great, amazing. Because enterprise is a good example. These things are not sold by people looking at websites, right? These people are sold to CTOs. These things are sold to CTOs. And so that's a very, very different problem than you're building something in the consumer space and you have 5 seconds of time to convince somebody arriving on your landing page they clicked on from Instagram that something is worth your time, right? Hugely different. And now in a sea of vibe-coded sites, sticking out is actually really, really important. So I think depending on the type of use case, you just need a completely different approach to design, which is also interesting.
One of my favorite things that I heard about editing, specifically when it comes to teammates, is Keith Raboy. He has this concept of when you're working with someone, you want to essentially expect that there will be times to take out the red marker and edit, and put line edits and really be thorough there and correct things and give people feedback. But the idea with management and editing is that the more time goes on, you want to use the red marker less and less. Mm-hmm. I'm curious how you think, one, how that resonates with you, and then two, how you think that relates to working with AI versus working with people.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. And I think with AI, I think the same is true. I think there was this cool like GIF that somebody created or like some meme graphic. Forgot who did it, but it was about the process of getting to results, right? And so usually you have like this, you build this like, I don't know, like parts of a car first, and then you kind of build up on it until you have the final car, right? Yeah. And so now in that picture, you saw this fancy alien car first with all belts and whatever, like, like crazy extrusions, right? And it's blue and whatever, and then you kind of like trim it down until it looks like a real car, right? I think that's certainly true. And to your point, if you're doing a first edit for a novel, there's usually way too much in it. There's usually like you're meandering in all sorts of directions. There's continuity issues. And the same is true for design work. If you're building a large landing page and you first describe what you want, I think any AI model right now, GPT maybe a bit less so than Claude, will first try to put everything on there that you might need. Not that you will need, but that you might need. And one common principle to actually counter that is to say, afterwards, you're going to cut until it hurts. Right? You will remove more than you intended to remove, because you can always bring things back, but there's usually too much stuff. And then you kind of do the squint test and say, like, does this still work? But it is a challenging process, especially because you so quickly feel ownership over something that you created, even if it was created with AI, right? You create something, and then you have this beautiful case study section maybe, or like this logo section that has like logos of companies, right? And you get attached to it because it looks cool, right? Maybe it's a happy little accident that the AI model generated. But then to have the discipline to say, I'm going to remove this again, is sometimes really hard. So that's tricky. But I do think it's very similar. So the editing process of getting to multiple iterations until there are no red markers anymore, red lines, it's very much the same thing. And in fact, it's exactly the same thing if you're using Impeccable, because there's this design linter that runs behind the scenes in design hooks. So when it edits your code and the linter runs under the hood and, for instance, finds 30 issues, the model can then fix 20 of them, so it produces 10 issues. And so it continues polishing your work until it finds at least no reported issues. That doesn't mean the design is great, but there's a process there that feels very similar. I actually called this, I was working on this other library called Radiant Shaders. And this was an open source project that didn't blow up as big as Impeccable, but it has some happy users, and it's a collection of shaders. So animated shaders that you could use on your website. And I documented my process of how I got there, and I called it carving shaders out of Claude code. Because I really liken the process of working with an agent as like carving something out of a stone block almost, right? And I think it's an interesting way to think about it. It's everything is already in the model, right? But then you have to like shape it.
This is really interesting because I've talked about startups in a lot of ways as chipping away from a block of marble versus starting from a blank canvas. Because I think oftentimes startups come from revealing something that is already there, and I just remember this quote or this idea that that sculptors are not necessarily starting from nothing. They're actually trying to free the object from the block of marble.
Yeah.
And I think about startups is they're actually trying to free what they're making from the marble. They're trying to pull it out of there. And in many ways, what you're talking about with an LLM is there is this block of marble, or this block of information. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to pull that out, and so you actually reveal it. And in many ways, you need to adjust as you go. It's not that you're going to have it come out perfectly, but you're going to adjust as you go and start to see something reveal itself and say, that looks good there, but maybe not over there. And I think that's I think it's a really powerful analogy for working with AI.
I think so. And it's also how you navigate the latent space in a model. That's the other interesting thing. For example, there's this common saying that LLMs are not funny, right? That they don't have humor. But that's simply not true. They just have 500,000 definitions of humor. Right? There are so many different funnies in the LLM, but they probably don't understand what you find funny. And so for you to figure out, okay, well, how do I create this camera? It's like, hole to pinpoint light through, right? That focuses on the exact definition of funny that you find funny. That's an art form in itself. But it's very similar, right? Like navigating the latent space.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because pretty much anybody's definition of anything is fairly specific to them and their preferences and their experiences, where they grew up. I mean, just think about spicy food, right?
Yes.
There's different types of spicy. And some people can't handle spicy food at all. Some people love spicy food. It's just this entirely subjective. Well, they try and have objectivity to it around these different units of measure, but I think that a lot of people would describe something as subjectively spicy in their own way, depending on where they're from or what they like.
Completely.
I'd love to maybe close on the kind of customary questions we ask, which at the end of conversations. This has been super fun. The first question is, sort of the bear case for being a solo founder, like why you shouldn't be a solo founder. We'll talk about that for a second, and then we'll transition over to what the case for solo founding is. But what's the reason that somebody should maybe consider not being a solo founder at this moment?
Well, I think there's a saying that it takes a certain type of crazy to found something in the first place, right? But I think not knowing whether you're actually crazy or not having a sounding board can be really, really hard sometimes. So I think if you're a solo founder, if you're going on that route yourself, which is great, at least find some people that can become your sounding board. That can be your friends and family, but better to have somebody who's actually objective. So I would say that's probably the biggest one. And then protect your attention, right? Protect the thing that you are truly capable of doing. You might be able to do that in another way by contracting things out, etc. But I think it's a bit harder to do. I think it's possible, but it's harder. Now it's also liberating because you can move faster. You don't have to negotiate with others. But those things I would say get harder.
When you talk about, and you touched on this a little bit, about doing the things that you like and sort of focusing on them and having potentially other people who can help with the other things, even if you don't have a co-founder. Maybe you share just a tiny bit more about that, focusing on the right things, because I think that it can be very easy to focus on the things that you like, maybe sometimes to the extent that you let the things that are important sort of fall by the wayside. One way to do that is to avoid that is to potentially hire a chief of staff early on, but you have to juggle a lot of things as a solo founder. Is there anything else that you've learned in this process before you brought on the chief of staff about sort of being able to focus, but also getting all of the other things done as well?
Yeah, I think one advice that I would give is look at your biology. And what I mean by that is, look at your decision fatigue, for instance. In my case, the way you organize your work through the day is really important. In my case, during the mornings, I have less decision fatigue. So I do more critical meetings with people. But then in the afternoons, I'm more creative, but I have decision fatigue. So now I start building. So for everybody, that's different. Everybody operates differently, but like really listen to your body and what it tells you. That's one advice I would give. I think the other one is focus on creating value. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but so many days during my corporate jobs, I woke up in the morning. Actually, no, I came home in the evening and I thought about, well, what value did I create today for the world, for anybody? And I didn't have an answer. And I think that's a terrible feeling. That actually leads to burnout. And it's so important to a solo founder as well. But what is the value that you create on every single day? And I think it's also the key to building a small company. I think people build large companies because they couldn't build a small company instead.
That's funny.
And so if you want to build a small company that's really effective, make sure that everybody you hire creates value every single day. You create that structure without middle management. So you make that true. And you have to focus on what it is that you put out there that's valuable.
That's a great point. The other thing about burnout, which is similar to this idea of make sure you're creating value, is that I think that one of the reasons that people experience burnout is due to a lack of momentum. Like momentum will solve for burnout very quickly. It's very energizing to have momentum. Versus burnout, you're usually not very energized because you're trying to push something. And I think that if you focus on creating value, that's sort of the early sort of leading indicator for creating momentum.
Yeah, momentum. I will say, it brings up a good point because there are so many things that can kill momentum. One thing that can kill momentum is hiring somebody into a role that cannot come in at the right elevation. It's somebody who's really bad at 0 to 1, but who's been very good at 5 to 10.
Yeah, super
easy to kill momentum that way. First thing the person wants to do is create a monorepo or introduce a ticketing system or whatever it is, right? But things that worked in a large team at some big Fortune 50 company, but certainly not the right thing for an early stage startup, right? So I think that's the other thing. Like, figure out what feeds you, what gives you energy, what gives you momentum versus what stops your momentum, what stops you in your tracks. There are so many things we learned about software engineering that are simply not true anymore. That's the other thing, right? The handoff process, the agile workflow, like going from design to engineering to like product design engineering, none of that stuff matters anymore. It's really interesting, like, because it cannot matter anymore in a workflow where we ship 50,000 lines of code every day. It's just not possible. So I'm seeing designers move into code. I'm moving engineers moving into design. I see product managers move into everything. And we just have to work completely differently. So I think there's a lot of things that we assume are needed that are not actually needed in order to build something valuable. So that's one way I protect my momentum.
Cool. Final question. The case for solo founding. What is the case for solo founding?
The case for solo founding is you only have to account to yourself. And you can move at the speed of your own thought and don't have to wait for anyone. I think it's especially important if you're in the early stages of exploration. And you also don't really need anyone when you're first building something that you envisioned in the first place. Now, unless you need help from outside, that is a big operation in the first place. But I think don't let it stop you from starting something. I think it's a big mistake to wait for somebody come around the door, right? The right person to join you. Just start it.
Well, this has been awesome. I'm really excited to, maybe in a few months or a year, come back and talk about what the Renaissance geeks are up to in the future. Because I mean, it's incredible right now. We love Impeccable. We use it all the time. And yeah, thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this conversation, we would love it if you could share Solo Founders with everyone you know, particularly people who are considering starting companies solo or who are already doing it. The entire goal of what we do is to normalize solo founding, encourage more people to solo found instead of end up with co-founders of convenience. If you'd like, and we'd really appreciate it, you can go leave a review on Apple. You can go give us a thumbs up. You can subscribe on the YouTube channel. Anything helps. And of course, if you are starting a company or considering starting a company, you should go look at the Solo Founders program. We work together with you in San Francisco alongside of a bunch of other solo founders. The idea is it's much better to be solo together than to be solo alone. I'll spend a lot of time helping you. And we also invest $100,000 in your company. So if you're excited to learn more about that, go check out solofounders.com/program.